Good afternoon. My name is Tanya Lee Irwin, and I'm the Assistant Director of the Washington Stormwater Center. On behalf of the Washington Stormwater Center, I would like to welcome all of you to our Lunchtime Municipal Webinar Series. Today we are happy to have Karen DeNicola, Brandy Loveliner, and Art Jenkins present about Washington's Regional Stormwater Monitoring Program and Eastern Washington Effectiveness Studies.
Okay, thank you, Tanya Lee, for that introduction. This is Karen DeNicola, and I'm going to start out by basically providing some context for the overall presentation that we're going to be giving. So what we're going to go through is the Clean Water Act permit-driven monitoring programs, of which ARTS is included, the effectiveness studies in Eastern Washington. And I'm going to talk about the different approaches to pooling resources of multiple entities together in order to do one coordinated approach for each region. And Brandy and I both will talk about some of the lessons we've learned in the process of going through the prioritization and creation of these programs, and a couple of results that are coming in because we actually started monitoring. Okay, so for anybody on the webinar that's not familiar with stormwater as a big problem, this is an expression of how we use the land. A very complicated problem that we are spending a huge amount of money and resources trying to address. Ecology issues stormwater permits to local governments to manage stormwater, and these permits are books. They're very long, detailed sets of requirements, programmatic activities that the local governments need to do to manage their stormwater. This costs them millions of dollars a year collectively, and the state is also spending millions of dollars a year to help manage stormwater. So where we are is, what do we tell policymakers when they ask if their investment is working? So we're trying to figure out what we really need to get out of permit-required monitoring to make sure that the stormwater management programs are protecting receiving waters. This is a little bit different from compliance monitoring. Any of you that are familiar with industrial facilities or construction sites, they are required to collect water samples to ensure that they are complying with the terms of their permits. But the municipalities are a little bit different because they don't have that kind of control over what goes into their system. This is everybody that lives and works and has business in their area. So it's a programmatic approach, and the monitoring that we do related to these permits is not compliance. It is basically adaptive management feedback monitoring. We're trying to get information about what's working, what's not working, where and why, under what conditions, so that we can improve the stormwater management programs over time and improve the permits as they work together. So things we want to learn in monitoring. We know stormwater is causing a lot of problems, and we're spending a lot of money managing these, trying to prevent these problems. So, and every dollar that we spend on monitoring is not getting spent on stormwater management. So we want to be targeted and modest in our approach to figuring out what we're going to monitor. We do want to know if things in lakes, rivers, streams, Puget Sound are getting better or worse. And as I said before, we want to know more specifically what is and isn't working. So all of this feedback is to help improve the management programs and the permits. So coming at this, we have different permit requirements in different parts of the state. We have Puget Sound, where we have 83 permittees, cities and counties, and the large ports of Seattle and Tacoma are in this area that are working together on one regional monitoring program. We have the Lower Columbia, where we have 8 permittees. We've got a couple of permittees here and here that don't get to play anywhere. They're sort of on their own. And then we have Eastern Washington, where we have essentially 10 islands of permittees from Yakima, Wenatchee, Spokane. We also have Pullman, Clarkston, Ellensburg, Moses Lake, and Walla Walla. So we've got we have very different settings where stormwater is expressing itself differently, and we need appropriately tailored monitoring programs to address the issues in those different regions. So from that context, I'm going to move into talking about the new stormwater monitoring programs that we have set up or are working on implementing in these 3 regions. So why are we doing something new? So in Washington and across the country, the permittees for municipal stormwater are divided into Phase 1 and Phase 2. Phase 1 were back in the 1990s had populations over 100,000 that were served by municipal separate storm sewers. And so they have had a couple of permits by now, and in their last permit, these largest permittees did outfall characterization monitoring. So they literally took samples of stormwater and so that we could really learn about various land uses and what they are expressing. And then we also had them doing some targeted effectiveness studies. And that monitoring provided good information, but it was very expensive and very challenging. And so even though it was valuable, we didn't think every permittee needed to repeat this effort. The smaller permittees in Washington, the Phase 2 permittees, didn't have monitoring requirements, but our Pollution Control Hearings Board that settles disagreements about the permits told the State Department of Ecology that these permittees would have to have monitoring in the next permit. And those permittees were very concerned about the high cost and complexity of implementing the kind of monitoring that the large permittees were doing. So they asked ecology for a different approach. And so in this idea of a bigger coordinated picture, we're looking for those kinds of results and findings that are going to be applicable to stormwater management programs that are implemented across the region. So this is back in 2005. We wanted a regional monitoring program, but we didn't know what it should look like. That old paradigm of every permittee doing their own monitoring is where we were. And to get to a new regional monitoring program, we needed input not just from the permittees, but from the broad set of stakeholders that are interested in stormwater management and addressing the stormwater problem. So we started this effort focused in Puget Sound. Ecology went into this process very open to changing the approach in the permits and knew that it would take some doing and some resources and some time. So we needed to come up with a way to get all of the stakeholders involved in creating this new approach. So the water quality program at Ecology provided staff and some consulting support, and we created a process to develop recommendations for the next permit, which is actually the current permit. So the rest of the talk with Brandy and me is laid out like this slide. I'm going to talk about the process that we went through, and then Brandy is going to talk about the program. Okay, so why so much process? So we could monitor a lot of things to get information about stormwater. We can't possibly monitor everything we want to, and we need to figure out the difference of process is to get broad agreement on what the questions and the priorities are, and basically agreement and understanding of the approach that we're going to take. We had a process that was designed to gather a lot of feedback, and Ecology basically just set the stage and gave some pretty big sideboards, provided some support and some ideas to consider, and then let the stakeholders decide. And the Puget Sound Monitoring Consortium that preceded this effort had to sort of model a caucus-based approach to decision-making. That approach was used, and it continues to be used, by what's called the Stormwater Work Group in Puget Sound. And they have come up with a very good scientific framework that was peer-reviewed, got very positive feedback from national experts. They defined a very appropriate level of effort and came up with an implementation plan that included which part of this overall scientific framework should be implemented through the permits. So this Stormwater Work Group that was convened in 2008 is a formal stakeholder committee that makes recommendations to Ecology and other key agencies that are responsible for monitoring. So Stormwater Work Group had a formal facilitator through the whole beginning of the process, and this was pretty important. When we started this process, we had a group of people sitting around a table that would hardly even make eye contact. They thought that this would be a colossal waste of time and just were coming very grudgingly. But so we sort of formed this new government with lots of structure and formality to get the process off the ground. By 2010, when we made our formal recommendations, we were functioning very, very well. And now we don't even have a formal facilitator role. We just have the caucuses doing their work and the representatives coming to the table and ecology staff just supporting their work. So this local government caucus that was formed is a pretty big deal. The local government stormwater managers have collectively formed a caucus, and they have representatives and others. They have their own meetings, and they give their representatives input on the things that are being discussed at the table, and so then their representative speaks for them. So this is a really good example of a collective process where people with their own agendas can get together and let others speak for them. So this whole process was a lot of oscillation from big groups to little groups of people. We have the caucuses, and then we have subgroups that work on technical stuff, technical or topical kinds of issues that we need to do. And so those are less formal. They're not like the formal stormwater work group, but these are all sort of open to whoever wants to participate, and they basically generate things for the stormwater work group to consider. And then we also take what the stormwater work group is considering on certain levels to public workshops where we have really big groups. So we've had several public workshops with anywhere from 60 to 200 people participating. So process, dozens and dozens of meetings about a very broad range of topics. So that Puget Sound Monitoring Consortium that preceded this effort had surveyed national groups and come up with a big recommendation to start small and build on those efforts. And we have not really started small, but we've got a lot of people with their eyes and fingerprints on lots of pieces of the process, and doing our best to keep people up to speed. So what were the stakeholder recommendations? This is back in 2010. This was as ecology was writing the last round of municipal stormwater permits for Western Washington. So there were 88 recommendations about how to set this program up, and 85 of them were by complete consensus of all of the stakeholders that were involved. And so the few majority recommendations did come through with a very clear explanation of what the concerns were of the folks that didn't agree with the recommendation. And so a representative of each stakeholder actually met with the ecology director at the time, who was Ted Sturdivant, and explained the recommendations, and ecology decided to accept the recommendations and use them as the basis of the permit requirements. So there was some more engagement with the stakeholder group as the recommendations got translated into a permit. But overall, the consensus of the stakeholders was really powerful. Having all of these stakeholders work together and figure out their common needs and interests, different from a lot of our other permitting processes and actions, and it carries a lot of weight. So in a nutshell, that was the process. Now I'm going to tell you a little bit more about what the specifics of some of the recommendations and move into the permit requirements, and then Brandy will talk about launching the program. So those 88 detailed recommendations outlined, how you would establish a new regional stormwater monitoring program. Some very specific ideas about what the priorities were for status and trends in receiving waters, what we were looking for in effectiveness studies, and what were the goals of source identification and diagnostic monitoring types of information that get wrapped into the overall monitoring program. So another big recommendation in 2010 was that all permittees must participate, just require everybody to pay in. That was a little uncomfortable for ecology from a legal standpoint. We felt like folks needed an option to not send a check to the Department of Ecology in order to comply with their permit. We'll talk a little bit more of that in a moment. But so ecology created some what's called opt-out requirements, ways that permittees could choose to conduct their own monitoring. And there were 2 permittees doing that for status and trends, and 1 doing it for effectiveness studies. And then the other recommendation was that ecology should be the RSP administrator, and I'll talk a little bit more about that too. So overall, like, these recommendations are the science priorities, the funding approach, and the implementation. So why ecology? Ecology had more expertise and experience with doing the contracting and the administration that the other groups that were surveyed were not able to provide at anywhere near a reasonable overhead rate. The permittees really didn't want to put 40% of their funds into overhead, and ecology was able to do this for 5% overhead for this permit cycle, and that was a very attractive option. But also, but it was really, this is going to be a lot of money, and we really needed somebody that knew how to do the contracting. So they didn't do this lightly. It was a lot of, everybody knew it was kind of weird for ecology's permit to have one of the requirements be to send a check to ecology. But so we have put a lot of effort into setting up a very transparent and accountable approach for administering this program. So the permittees either pay into the pooled funding account for the permit, or they conduct their own monitoring, and they're doing that for the whole permit term. So ecology is administering this program, but it's not our program. It's the stakeholders program. The stakeholders, which include the permittees, are identifying what we're going to monitor and what level of budget is appropriate for that effort. And they've gone through this whole process making sure that they are leveraging other regional monitoring efforts and not duplicating other funding. So they do have ongoing oversight by a stakeholder group, which is the Pooled Resources Oversight Committee. This is another formal committee that has caucus representation and formal charter. And this group meets about every other month now. It'll eventually meet only once a quarter. But they get regular updates from the RSMP Coordinator, and they give project management type oversight. But what they're really doing is making sure that ecology, through the contracts for the RSMP, are implementing the recommendations that the stakeholder group has made. This group, also this Pooled Resources Oversight Committee, may review ecology's performance as the RSMP administrator and eventually recommend some other process. It's up to them. So we'll see what happens in the next thing. So, but what's really important is that this Pooled Resources Oversight Committee and the Stormwater Work Group make the decisions. Ecology is not making the decisions. So some of the lessons we're learning, having the stakeholders make these decisions outside of the permit means that we can respond very nimbly to things that we're learning in real time, whereas whatever's in the permit is in the permit for 5 years, and it doesn't change. So in addition to being inflexible, ecology's actually had to spend a lot of work figuring out how to make that the other monitoring work. So we're thinking about creative ways to improve that next permit cycle. One of the things that the permittees really wanted to do with this monitoring program is have a standalone program, that if another program that we were leveraging just stopped and went away, that this would still be a meaningful effort. And we are seeing, especially with state budget cycles going back and forth, that there is not 100% reliability that other long-term monitoring programs continue. So coming up with effectiveness questions for a regional program it's been interesting, and we've got, Brandon will talk about the studies we have going. We're about to start a process of identifying another round of effective questions to do, but that's probably the most worthwhile part of the stakeholder process now. All of this said, Puget Sound is probably the easiest place to do this because of the nature of development and how it impacts the receiving water in Puget Sound. But this is what we had to do to come up with effectiveness studies. Just concluding the portion about Puget Sound, ecology was open to changing the permits, and we gave away a very strategic part of our decision-making authority to the stakeholders. And it hasn't been a very straight line to get from the stakeholder recommendations to the stormwater requirements to this new monitoring program, but we are implementing this new monitoring program and seeing a lot of success. So now Brandy Lubliner, the RSMP coordinator, is going to talk about, there's just as much work getting this program up and running as there has been developing the recommendations and figuring out what the framework is going to be.
I'm Brandy Lubliner, and I work at Ecology as the RSMP Coordinator. And I was brought on about a little over a year ago, and it's been a fast learning curve to get this thing going the way that the Stormwater Work Group had intended. And Ecology is the service provider, so this is kind of a bulleted list in a way of basically what it is that I'm doing. I'm working contracts, I'm making sure the state has the spending authority we need, I'm managing the 3 different accounts and signing contracts out of those accounts. I provide oversight for the Pooled Resources Committee. I provide quarterly budget reports, and then I review deliverables when they come in with the help of a liaison, and I'll talk about that later. And then we put deliverables on the web, and then I also have both a background in science and engineering, so I can review these things with a technical eye as well. And then we want to make sure we're sharing this information in the most transparent way possible. As Karen mentioned, there's 3 big components to the RSMP, and the RSMP is the monitoring under the permit. And 3 big components are status and trends, effectiveness studies, and source ID. And I'll just talk about status and trends, kind of big picture here for a slide or two. Back in 2010, Stormwater Work Group made recommendations to Ecology on what this program, how it should move forward. And they wanted to focus on receiving waters and use a probabilistic design, and that means a random design, so that the sites that are picked for the monitoring can roll up, the data can roll up and make a statement about the condition of that receiving water as a whole in this region. It's not necessarily a site-by-site study design. And the other big piece was they want to leverage off of existing programs, tweak them so that they can answer more of a stormwater management question, but use the long-term science when it's available. And to get going, there were a few grants and a few Ecology supported some things to help define how the permittees pooled resources would be used. And for example, they funded a gauging analysis to figure out if gauging was a high priority piece that would need to be worked on, or if there are big gaps. They also funded a pilot study with the mussels to figure out should that program use caged versus native mussels. And then they issued the permits based on recommendations and drafted some draft QAPs, which are the quality assurance project plans, to get the program going. Once the permittees made their decision, we were ready to go. There are about 3 elements of the status and trends monitoring program as well. The first one is small streams in the Puget lowlands, and this was like a GIS exercise to isolate what we consider the lowlands, and then we populated that area with sites, and that monitoring is going on right now. It'll finish up in December. It's this entire calendar year for water quality. And then in this fall and winter and next summer, we'll start our marine element, which is a shoreline layer in front of the urban areas. So it's going to be a little bit smaller effort, but there's different components. So DFW is going to use those caged mussels and filter contaminants out of the water in front of the shoreline areas. And then we'll also collect some sediments in those near shore areas as well next summer. I just want to dive into streams just a little bit more. It's a really huge effort, and we're hoping to learn a lot this year. This year will give us this large status assessment, and we're going to be running quite a few parameters, and we're going to have 100 sites for the benthic macroinvertebrates and habitat and sediment, and we'll have 60 sites of year-long water quality and flow data. And so from this effort, we hope to get recommendations on what to carry forward in the next phase, which would become the trend program, because this first year is just really just going to be a status assessment. And there's 2 strata going on. We're studying specifically the urbanized streams within the urbanized area and streams on the outside of the urban area. And the designation there is, like, this is site 44 on the within, which is the WUGA strata. This picture is just to show you basically where these sites are. We have the within the urban area sites, and we have the outside the urban area sites. You can see it's the Puget Sound region, lowland region. And this also kind of gives you an idea. All these bullets basically on the slide are the warm bodies that I've contracted in to get the work done. and it's a large effort between the labs and the monitoring crews. So as I said, we'll get a status assessment out of this effort, and we'll make recommendations. We'll have the scientists make recommendations for the trend program, and then we'll see what that looks like to move forward. And this is a receiving water program, but we want to contextualize the information as much as we can in terms of what's going on the land, how we're managing our stormwater. And so this way, this permittee effort basically can be used to track stormwater management and the health of the receiving water over time. The second part of the status and trends is part of the nearshore and its mussels. These shows you the caged mussels. Basically, these mussels are grown in a laboratory situation. Well, not quite a laboratory, I guess I'd say. They're grown by Penn Cove, which is a shellfish provider, but they're all the same age. They've been selected. They've been culled through, and they're the same size. They're the same age, and they were grown the same way. So basically that's the same starting point. And then we can use them, put them out in the environment at these different sites, and they will filter the contaminants out of the water. And Jennifer Lanksberry is running this. She has a contract with the RSMP, and based on her pilot study, she's going to leave these, the cage mussels work really well, and she's going to leave them out 1 month longer than she did in the pilot study. And I have a map here that kind of shows you where a bunch of the sites are, the larger green circle. These are the initial candidate sites, and she'll go out there and make sure that those will actually work and the mussels will be retained at that site. She has sponsors and volunteers helping her out, as she did in her pilot effort. And again, the results will be a status assessment this time, and then she'll provide recommendations for the RSMP trend program in the future. And I've heard that National Mussel Watch has underwent a big contractual process, or constricting process, I guess I'd say it. They're losing a bunch of funds, and they are interested in what is going on over here in Puget Sound, and are considering a similar kind of effort for the Chesapeake Bay. Okay, so for the status and trends, you can follow us. We have a website with different tabs going across the top of this map. This would be a streams tab here, and then if you clicked this tab, you could follow the mussels effort, the nearshore sediment effort, and there was a bacteria effort that's not going to include monitoring this time, but will include a data analysis. And then the option 2 is for the permittees that opted out of the pooled resources. So the next big component is the effectiveness studies, and Karen alluded to the process that it took to get to a list of studies to fund. Most of them, these studies that we have, are going to be led by local governments that will and then some of them will subcontract to private contractors. We have steering committees on most of the projects, and most of the projects are multi-year projects. This is the list of 10 that we agreed to out of the first workshop process to fund, and we know we need to solicit some more projects. The ones that are in blue, I guess it's a little bit heavier blue, are underway. I have them under contract, and we have one more that's kind of in progress right now, working on the scope of work, and we have 3 remaining in black that we need to get underway this fall. They are in a priority order, and so you'll notice, why is number 1 the not contracted yet? It's basically due to timing, that the other projects had timing issues where the retrofit was being done now, and so it wouldn't make sense to wait a year to monitor the effects of that. And also the project lead for number 1 is just fine waiting till this fall to get underway. I'll just go into a little bit of detail with these, not too much. You can contact me at any time, of course, to learn more about individual projects, or go to the website, which I'll show you later. One of the first projects is the Urban Stream Small Stream Watershed Scale Retrofit. This is being led by Redmond and Andy Rayum, and it's a rather large effort. It's really a national interest project where several small subbasins are going to be retrofitted with stormwater controls to meet the current standards, and we will monitor over time to see if that gets us to, kind of a quote-unquote recovered natural receiving water, where the benthic macroinvertebrates, the water quality, the sediment quality, all meet standards. And we're going to see how long that takes, or if there's more that needs to be done. And it's a very scientifically robust design, and so this is going to be a very useful study for our region. The second bullet is kind of about two projects that are basically retrofitting large regional stormwater detention or treatment areas before they discharge into highly sensitive water bodies like a lake or a creek, basically the headwaters of a creek. And while these are somewhat unique to the setting, or the BMPs being used or being retrofitted are somewhat unique to the site, the permittees discussed the need to basically start collecting this kind of information and learn how big, large, complex retrofits benefits sensitive waters. And the third project, I guess I just wanted to go into real quickly, is at WSU, Puyallup and NOAA working together in the toxicity to Coho salmon using untreated and then filtered stormwater. And the RSMP wanted to leverage that study effort that they've already done on their pilot project and get some specific information about engineered soils, the 60-40 soil mix required by Ecology's stormwater manual. And so they built some biocolumns, or some columns with the 60-40 mix, and we do have some results from this project. We're learning that the 60-40 mix, as written in the manual, does prevent the toxicity to coho, both the adults that are turning to spawn and the eggs that are fertilized. And so this is great information. It's good feedback that at least we know the 60-40 mix is going to export nutrients and metals, and we need to work on that mix so that it exports less. But at least we know that projects that have been done to date, 60-40, are helpful. They are helpful in preventing toxicity to coho. And then this is a slide on a couple more of the projects that are underway. They're just getting going. Basically, a couple efforts to assess whether or not bioretention facilities perform hydrologically as we believe they do in the manuals and the way they're designed. Once they're actually built, how well do they do? This one and the Rain Garden project are somewhat similar in that venue, in that they will need to gather sites around the region to follow and test their performance. Another project underway is to evaluate some source control at small businesses and just basically learn what's working and what isn't working so we can communicate it to a larger audience. So here's the website I was talking about. You can follow us here. It's not quite as pretty as the other one yet, but we're working on it. But you can follow these projects. And then the last big topic is source ID. And don't want to cut art short too much. So I mainly want to say, that we have this element here where we have under contract, where we're going to gather the information that is sent by the permittees in the annual reports and basically try to learn from it as much as we can on source control and try to figure out, is there a way that the state government can help the local permittees with this effort? Is there education, training, licensures, things like that are needed to tackle source identification? I produce a quarterly report and I put those online, so it's a very tidy way to follow the RSMP. And again, here's some information, this slide, that you can contact us later. And I'll turn it back over to Karen.
Okay, I'm going to run through what we're doing in the Lower Columbia in Southwest Washington really quickly. So the 8 permittees that are in that Lower Columbia part in Southwest Washington are participating in the effectiveness studies and the source identification information repository for Western Washington, but not in the receiving water component. They don't have Puget Sound as receiving water. So they have just finished developing a receiving water study design in actually May, I think that final report came out. And so here is where you can find that final report. And they still have a few technical details yet to work out, but overall they're really talking about implementation. So who's going to do the monitoring? What's the permittee's role? What other agencies are contributing? They're also using a caucus approach to making the stakeholder recommendations, not a formal one like in Puget Sound, but a caucus approach. And their recommendations are due to ecology next spring. Just overall, this area in purple is Clark County. There's a little bit of Mount Rainier National Park in Pierce County up there, but that's federal land. But this is basically showing where the permittees are in Southwest Washington. You can see Kelso and Longview and Vancouver, and then this is the Clark County area. So, and then there's some other urban areas that aren't covered by the permit. The probabilistic sampling effort in Puget Sound went by this probabilistic approach that's been used for more than 20 years, trying to basically make sure that you have a randomized approach. You're not going to your favorite site and sampling in the same place. You want to have the kinds of results that roll up and apply to the whole region. So they used to go by all these little sites that were like 500 meters apart, and the process of confirming and making sure that these sites are all going to work, you can end up going all around the place and spending a lot of effort, which is actually what we did in Puget Sound. What Derek Booth at Stillwater Sciences came up with was a way to, rather than focusing on sites that represent 500 meters, let's look at reaches that represent the range of drainage areas that we're interested in when we're talking about stormwater management. So rather than looking at all those points, they're looking at those reaches. And so these are the reaches that are in Clark County inside the urban areas that are covered by the permit. And then this is the ones that are outside of the urban areas, but they're still in Clark County covered by the permit. So rather than looking at that headache-inducing thing of dots that I showed a couple slides earlier, they're focusing on randomly generated subset of these sites. So these are the ones that are in Longview and Kelso. Here inside the urban area here, but those will be combined with the other ones. So that's the approach that they're going at, and this is which is a new design. And then this is the metrics that they're talking about. They're basically focusing on a couple of things to continuously monitor, but mostly going out and focusing on the sediments and the stream benthos once a year. And they did a lot of work to make sure that they picked sites that had good signal-to-noise grades. What they're doing now is they're confirming sites, they're figuring out their budgets, getting roles and responsibilities together, and they're deciding whether they're going to use that same pooled resources approach that they're already using for effectiveness studies in CIDR because they have to. Did they want to use that same approach and have ecology be the administrator for their status and trends monitoring, or do they want to do something different? And they're talking about that right now, and then they're going to finalize their quality assurance plan. So we're going to go on to Art, and I was just going to provide this. In Eastern Washington, we got 10 islands. So and they are not looking at receiving water monitoring. They're focused in this permit term, just figuring out some effectiveness studies to do. So the permittees are basically doing this project, and ecology is sort of supporting in the background. So with that, I'll turn it over to Art.
Hello, this is Art Jenkins. I'm with the City of Spokane Valley. I'm the stormwater engineer here. So without further ado, Eastern Washington Effectiveness Studies Development, and I'd like to talk about our Phase 1 portion of that work and why we're doing what we're doing. So as an overview, why are we doing this work? Well, we've got permit requirements. And what is our plan of attack? Well, we've got a multi-year, multi-phase schedule. How did we do on our first phase? Because we're already done with that, just barely finished that. What is the next things that we're going to be working on? So the reason we're doing this is for our permit requirements. In some form or fashion, permit holders on this side of the state needed to come together and collaborate on permit requirement Section 8, Part B. We needed to look at study ideas reported in 2010 to ecology as part of our previous permit requirements. We needed to add to that list and look at how the study work would help our stormwater programs. We are required to identify lead entities for each of the studies, and a jurisdiction can't take on more than 2 studies. The permit holders are to rank and prioritize a final list of 12 to 15 study ideas by June 30th of 2016, a little less than a year from now. Study designs completed for 8 to 12 study ideas are due to ecology by June 30th of 2017. for their review and approval. And once we receive approval of those study designs, quality assurance project plans, or QAPPs, are to be completed within 6 months for ecology approval. We need to implement at least 4 of those studies that have QAPP approval within 6 months, and the remainder of the studies within 15 months following those QAPP approvals. And of course, with our reporting, lead entities need to report interim results annually, and at the end of the study, all participating permit holders shall report the final results and recommend future actions for their programs based on those results. So all these permit requirements promulgated the birth of a multi-year, multi-phase project called the Eastern Washington Effectiveness Studies Development Project. It's a collaboration between 18 cities and 6 counties, which represents all of the municipal permitted entities for stormwater discharges in Eastern Washington. We parsed the requirements into 4 phases. The first phase to deal with the questions, what can be done, so what study ideas should be done, and how much will it cost. And I'll talk about phase 1 in a minute. Phase 2 goes into the questions, what is important, so what are the top ranked ideas, and who are the lead entities or agencies that will manage the lead on those study ideas. In phase 3, we actually perform the study design and the QAPP for 8 to 12 study ideas. And so it talks about, that's answering the question of how will the work be completed, how will the data be collected. And in phase 4, we actually do the study work, report on the data gleaned, and analyze the data and report some final recommendations. So phase 1 has been completed here recently. It started about 2 years ago, and this process was more than just coming up with ideas. We wanted to make sure that the ideas were sound, that they would be useful and beneficial to helping us with Eastern Washington stormwater programs. We also did not want to reinvent the wheel, so we required doing some literature research and performing a gap analysis of what work had not been studied yet. Or if study work had been completed, should it be verified for our local conditions here? Now, after approval from the group that had come together, which we call the Eastern Washington Stormwater Group, a very conceptual idea of a study was looked at to develop a range of costs for each study idea. Having this information helped us in determining which studies have the best potential return on investment or water quality benefit for the cost expended. Different ideas were discussed on how to cost share and fund the studies. An initial list was generated based on an informal polling of permittees' representatives. We also had identified some of the projects for those that had promoted them. They by default became the lead entities of those projects. So I want to give kudos to the Roads and Highways subgroup of the Stormwater Working Group over in the Puget Sound area. I was involved in 2012 and 2013 in helping that group, and I was greatly benefited, I believe, and was able to spring from the shoulders of that working group to develop our set of study ideas on this side of the state. And a big part of that was this tool called the Research Proposal Template. And I want to in particular give kudos to Mark Maurer and Larry Schaffner, who were with the Washington State Department of Transportation at the time and were the real drive behind the Research Proposal Template. This template was instrumental in helping our group develop study ideas that would be defined and ready to be considered in a world of competing interests. It became the main deliverable in the discussion of all of the ideas. It prepares the idea to be considered for study funding through local, state, and national opportunities. So it's kind of a prospectus in a way of in getting us ready for grant opportunities. One thing we did add to this form was a blurb about how the study idea was relevant, or what was the nexus to the Eastern Washington Permit and or stormwater programs. So phase 1, what did we accomplish? Well, we formed a group and met to create and discuss effectiveness studies that would help our programs. All 24 permittees were represented or participated in some shape or form during the two-year process. We developed 23 ideas that met with initial ecology staff approval and with our group's approval. There was a lot of ideas that were good ideas but weren't necessarily ready to be a study or an effectiveness study idea. We did do the initial informal priority ranking, low, medium, high, and we discovered there's a lot of similarities and differences between our jurisdictions, and that was the surprising thing, is the amount of differences. We also started a discussion on how to pay for this stuff from the local level, if there's a local component that needs to be funded. This is not a final ranked list. However, if you look at the initial ranking of low and eliminated those 4 studies, we are left with 19. From there, we will need to cut it down another 4 studies to get to the initial ranked list of 12 to 15 study ideas. I will point out that study 2 was initially ranked high on this list, and that's a project that has interest from both sides of the state. Here's a map of the state and kind of the drainages around the state, in and around the state, including what's in purple. The hatched areas are the urban areas where our municipal stormwater permits are primarily engaged. You'll note that in eastern Washington, the urban zones are spread out and not as concentrated as around the Puget Sound area. We also have in eastern Washington 4 distinct climate areas or regions, much which is considered semi-arid, and vegetation must be supported with irrigation. Stormwater systems in some locations even commingle with agricultural runoff. Rain events are not as frequent as in other locations in the state, and most do not develop a substantial amount of runoff to directly monitor with grab sampling at the end of outlet pipes. So monitoring in the typical sense is very difficult and limited in this side of the state. Counties cover large areas but have very small urbanized zones affected by the permit regulations. And I want to point out that with some notable exceptions, most areas have a substantially high amount of stormwater that infiltrates into the ground. Lessons learned. There are a lot of differences between eastern Washington jurisdictions. That was the surprising thing that I learned. Even next door to each other. Here in the city of Spokane Valley, most of our water infiltrates into the ground through retention and underground infiltration. We have a neighbor next door to us that has a lot of basalt formations, which cause higher amounts of runoff, and that runoff is generally piped to the Spokane River or through combined sewers. We also are a relatively young city in the fact that we don't have a whole lot of deciduous leaf in the fall. But our neighbors to the west and in other locations around eastern Washington have a number of older areas with curbs, gutters, and deciduous trees, while we have pine needles as our main nemesis in the fall. I want to point out too that some eastern regions experience only 9 inches of rainfall a year, while others get upwards of 24 inches. Some areas experience extreme windstorm events carrying heavy amounts of sediment and hay from neighboring agricultural activities. One of the other things that we learned through this process, or I learned in particular, was online meetings were great at getting more people involved in different ways so that we didn't have to spend a lot of time traveling to meet one-on-one. But they did not completely replace the in-person meetings and the amount of work that you can get done with people one-on-one. Our next steps include monthly meetings through the fall to discuss phase 2 and who will be lead entities for the various study ideas, which studies we're going to fund and which will help us to determine the ranking as well as the prioritization of the studies. Plus, how are we going to cost share? Who will be the bank, in other words, to handle all of the funding and take care of each of these studies and manage each of the studies, and getting our final list to ecology by next June. So we did a grant interest survey for the gross grants here recently. We had 10 different ideas that came up, and 19 out of the 24 jurisdictions participated in our survey over a week's time period. Probably could have gotten higher participation had it not been in the summer months and vacations and that sort of thing got in the way. I'm happy to report that the Eastern Washington Effectiveness Study Development Phase 2 and 3 received the highest ranking amongst all gross grant ideas. The second idea is actually one that we had listed as an effectiveness study, and we combined with Kitsap County when we heard that they were interested in a very similar study to make something that I believe will be of statewide benefit. And so if we're successful at getting the Mobile Business Outreach and Education gross grant, that's easy for you to say, we will work with Kitsap County to develop an effectiveness study that meets ecology's approval and permit requirements under S8B for Eastern Washington jurisdictions.
All right, thank you very much all. We do have a quick question that was answered by Karen to Don Gatchelin from Yakima County, but Karen, if you could just sum up your response. The question was, this was referring to the Regional Stormwater Monitoring Group, but also I think to the pooled resources. So if you could just give a quick summary of your very thorough and good reply to Don so that everyone could hear it, that would be great.
Okay, so I think that I'm thinking that Don was asking because the Eastern Washington permittees are trying to figure out their banking arrangements, as Art said. They're trying to figure out how did this get formalized? This process of is there a memorandum of understanding or some sort of agreement between ecology and the Pooled Resources Oversight Committee? And the answer is there's not. What there is, ecology has, so with this group, we took their recommendations and turned them and used them in the permit. We're very clear about where we were having trouble doing exactly what the group recommended, and we built a lot of trust with that group that we said, yes, we will serve as the RSMP administrator, and we want this oversight process. We want to provide the transparency and the accountability and let everybody see what we're doing and make sure that everybody sees that ecology is not making these decisions, that the Stormwater Work Group and the Pooled Resources Oversight Group are making the decisions. So the permit is, so there's two ways money goes. Money goes into the fund and money goes out of the fund. And there's different formal agreements for both of those sides. So the permit is the main device for getting money into the fund. It's a permit requirement that if you have chosen to participate in the RSMP, that you submit this amount of money to this fund by this date. And then there are a couple of jurisdictions that said, yes, we want to have a contract with ecology. When we do that, we don't think the permit is enough with all the information in the fact sheet about what we're going to do with that money. So so that's how the money gets into the fund, and then the money gets out of the fund by, it's just the process of doing contracts. It's a state contract. It's a contract between ecology and each entity doing the work, but ecology hasn't gone through the process of putting together that contract until the Pooled Resources Oversight Committee has said yes, that contract looks good. Go ahead and do it. So that's those two sides of the bank that need to be set up. How to get money in, and that permit requirement, it makes it very clear for everybody to see if they complied with their permit. That's what the little jurisdictions all wanted. They just wanted to write a check and say, I complied with my permit monitoring requirements. On the other side, that's all outside of the permit. Everything about getting the work done is outside of the permit.
Okay. Thank you very much, Karen, once again, and thank you, Brandy and Art, also for participating and being with us.